There are several different dimensions that we have to look at. First, the feasts, the biblical calendar, these were given as gifts to the Jewish people. This was not bondage. This was a gift to the Jewish people. This is part of a special heritage. This was something that would tie Israel back in with its history and ultimately have Israel looking ahead to the future. This is something that would help keep Israel be separate from the nations by having a distinct calendar. So in and of themselves, there's nothing negative about them. There's nothing bad about them. This is all positive and wonderful and should be recognized as such. They are the feasts of the Lord, the holy days of the Lord. What God was against, and Isaiah 1 mentions it, Amos 5 you mentioned is against it, Jeremiah 6 and 7 have references against it as well, Micah 6, Hosea 6. There are different passages, Psalm 40, that would seem to indicate that God didn't want these anymore, that he was sick and tired of them. In the prophetic passages that I mentioned, what he was sick and tired of was hypocritical worship. For example, in Isaiah 1, he says, I don't want you trampling my courts. He said, I don't want you lifting your hands in prayer because your hands are stained with blood. He said, I don't want your holy days, convocations. I don't want your Sabbaths. So they had taken something sacred and made it abominable. Proverbs says even the prayer of the wicked is an abomination. So we know prayer is a wonderful thing. And Isaiah 1 says, I don't want it. I don't want you raising your hands. So the problem was not the feast. The problem was not prayer. The problem was not the Sabbath. The problem was hypocrisy. The problem was people with a wicked heart now thinking if I just keep the outward routines, God will be happy with me. It would be like God telling a pastor in his church, I don't want your tithes. I don't want your Sunday services. I don't want your hymns. You're hypocrites. The problem was not with the tithes or the Sunday services or the hymns. The problem was with hypocrisy. Now, what about some of these New Testament texts that you mentioned? We know that in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul writes to the Corinthians and tells them to keep the feast of Passover, that Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Whether he means it metaphorically, spiritually keep the feast, or whether he actually means that they should observe it, either way it wasn't a negative. It was not something that would pull them down or be anti-spirituality. In Colossians 2 and in Galatians 4, he's dealing with some issues. In Galatians, where there was a legalism and a teaching that you had to be circumcised and obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. In Colossians, it seems that there was some of that teaching, but more mingled with a type of Gnosticism and other mystical Jewish beliefs and angelic worship, some odd type of religious mix that they were getting into. And somehow they got to a point, these are Gentiles now, not Jews, remember. God never commanded the whole Gentile believing world to keep all the feasts. That's where you have that one reference that Paul makes, could be metaphorical or not, but there's nowhere where it was taught in all the letters, you must keep all the feasts. Yet they were now judging spirituality based on, are you keeping the Sabbath? Are you keeping the feast? And Paul said, no, these are shadows. The reality is found in the Messiah, and you have lost connection with the head. Similar to the hypocrisy things. What in the world is the use of your new moons and your Sabbaths and your holy festivals when you've lost sight of what they're actually pointing towards? You've concentrated on the shadow and lost sight of the reality. He doesn't forbid them from keeping these things, but he says your emphasis is wrong and you've gotten detached from the head. That is a problem I have seen with some believers that get so excited about the observance of days and new moons and feasts and festivals, they lose attachment with Jesus, Yeshua. They get so caught up with the shadow, they lose sight of the reality. As far as the Galatians, either they had fallen prey to thinking they had to keep all the Jewish holy days and new moons and Sabbaths, etc., in order to be right with God, and he's criticizing that, or they were also involved in some type of astral worship and sacred holy days. We know that there's nothing wrong with having holy days. And the Christians who often criticize Gentile believers and say you shouldn't keep the holy days, you shouldn't keep the seventh-day Sabbath, you shouldn't keep the feast, that's wrong. They have no problem keeping Sunday Sabbath, celebrating Easter, celebrating Christmas. So it's not wrong to say that these days are sacred for us in the Lord. It's wrong when either you judge spirituality based on that, it's wrong when you think I have to be right with God based on doing these things and I'm justified by doing them, or when you mingle in, as the Galatians may have, a wrong notion about the law with pagan practices as well. That's what Paul was dealing with. But the idea that it's wrong to keep the feast today, absolutely not. For Jewish believers, it's a way to connect back to their heritage, and it's a great way to teach family and to tell the larger Jewish community we are connected. For Gentile believers, as long as it's not done with bondage or an obligatory sense, it's a great way to tie back in with Jewish roots, to see the prophetic significance of the holy days, and even to tell the Jewish community, hey, we are part of you. We don't have a separate alien religion. Rather, this is what your faith is pointing towards.
The Hebraic Roots Conference will be held this fall, October 13th through the 15th. This conference is free, but space is limited, so please register your attendance online at HebraicRootsConference.com. Or you can call 952-657-7879.